Welcome back to the deep dive, ready to dive into some more fascinating stuff.
Always. What have we got today?
Today it's social intelligence, and we're using some excerpts that you all sent in from Daniel Goleman's Social Intelligence. I'm actually really excited about this one. I mean, who doesn't want to be more socially intelligent, right?
You're right. It's something we can all relate to. And Goleman's book, he really tries to get at the core of why we struggle or succeed socially.
Yeah, for sure. And the stories, right? I mean, he uses some amazing stories.
Yeah.
Like, have you gotten to the one with the military leader in Iraq
Oh, yeah.
facing down that angry mob? Talk about pressure.
I know.
I was like on the edge of my seat reading that. I don't know about you.
Oh, absolutely. And what I find so fascinating about that story, about Colonel Hughes and how he approached that situation, is that it really highlights just how fast our brains are working in social situations.
Yeah.
Especially when the pressure's on. He had to instantly assess the emotions of the crowd, consider cultural nuances, think about how his soldiers would react, and then formulate a plan to de-escalate the whole thing.
At the same time.
All at the same time. I mean, that's social intelligence in action right there.
It always makes you wonder if there's like a secret formula or something,
Right. Well, no magic formula, unfortunately.
Okay.
But Goleman does break down the core components of social intelligence. And one of the most interesting ones to me is the idea of this neural tango that's happening during every interaction we have.
Neural tango. Okay.
Yeah, so our brains, they're constantly influencing and being influenced by the people around us. It's almost like we have this um, unconscious thermostat effect on each other's emotional states.
So you're saying like even those really brief encounters, those quick moments when you pass someone on the street or chat with the cashier at the store, those actually have a lasting impact.
Exactly. Those everyday interactions, especially the ones with people we're closest to, they shape our brains over time. And it's not just about, our conscious thoughts or the words we're saying.
Okay.
Goleman really emphasizes that a huge part of our social processing, it happens under the surface, without us even realizing it.
Uh,
And he calls that the brain's low road.
Low road. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
And that's where things like what was it, emotional contagion
Yes.
that comes into play.
Exactly.
I was thinking about that story of patient X, the blind man who could still somehow read people's emotions.
Isn't that amazing?
It really brings that whole concept to life.
It really does. I mean, he couldn't consciously see facial expressions, obviously, but his brain was still picking up on those subtle emotional cues. So that's incredible. It really just shows you the power of this rapid, unconscious emotional processing that we're all doing all the time.
Wow. So we're like walking around influencing each other's emotions, and we don't even know it.
It's kind of wild when you think about it.
I'm starting to get a little self-conscious about my resting face all of a sudden.
Think of it this way. Our brains, they're wired for connection, right? And emotional contagion. It's just one of the ways that we create this sense of shared experience. And Volleman even connects this to the power of film, using that famous example of the first screening of the Lumiere brothers film way back when.
Uh-huh.
Imagine being in that audience. You see a train coming right at you. And even though you know it's not real, your brain still reacts instinctively, like, whoa.
It's true. Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating how our brains don't always, separate those real-life events from the stuff we see on screen.
Right.
Speaking of mirroring, right?
Yes.
Goleman also talks about how those subtle nonverbal cues, they play a huge role in building rapport.
Absolutely. Think about it. There are times when you just click with someone instantly.
Yeah.
And Goleman describes these studies where people unconsciously mimicked the interviewer's body language, and as a result, they actually felt a stronger connection with them. He even talked about Paul Ekman's work, with lie detection, and how a certain type of gaze, it can actually signal trust, not necessarily that someone's being truthful.
It makes you wonder just how much we're actually saying without ever, opening our mouths.
Right.
But I was thinking, doesn't that mirroring have to be, like, authentic?
Oh, yeah.
I feel like if someone sensed that I was, deliberately copying them, it would backfire big time.
Absolutely. You're right to be cautious. Goleman really emphasizes that if your mirroring is forced, or exaggerated, it's going to come across as fake, right?
Right.
And it can even seem manipulative. Genuine rapport that comes from subtle, unconscious synchronicity, it emerges naturally when two people are truly connecting.
This is all so much more nuanced than I ever realized. Like, it's not just about being nice or being, like, super outgoing. There's a whole other layer of communication happening beneath the surface. It's amazing.
Right.
But, okay, I was thinking, What about those times when we do need to be a bit more deliberate in our social interactions? That's where that high road comes in, right?
Exactly. So the high road, that's the conscious, deliberate social processing that happens. It happens in the prefrontal cortex, the executive center of our brains. This is where we can actually pause, we can reflect, and then choose our responses carefully, especially in situations that are, a bit more challenging. And Goleman uses a great example of a woman who has to navigate these really tricky interactions with her sister, who's a little bit volatile.
Oh, wow.
And she doesn't just react impulsively. Instead, she uses her high road to stay calm and choose responses that de-escalate the situation.
That's so smart. So, like, while the low road helps us quickly figure out someone's emotions, the high road gives us that extra level of control,
Exactly.
especially when things get, a little heated or tricky.
Yeah.
It's like having a steering wheel for our social interaction.
Oh, that's a great analogy. And that high road, it becomes even more important when we're dealing with strong emotions or trying to navigate, those complex social situations.
Right. Makes sense.
Goleman even talks about what happens when that high road gets damaged, and he uses the example of, lobotomies, which is a bit unsettling.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a pretty stark reminder of how important the prefrontal cortex is for our social well-being.
Right. I mean, it really underscores how crucial it is to cultivate those high road skills. Just think about it. How many arguments could we avoid? How many misunderstandings could be cleared up if we all got a little bit better at, regulating our emotions and choosing our responses thoughtfully?
That's a good point. But it also makes me wonder, what happens when someone's high road isn't working properly? And I don't just mean from a brain injury. Like, what if it's something more, inherent to their personality?
Ooh, that's a great question. And that actually leads us into some of the, darker aspects of social intelligence, or maybe the lack of it, I should say. But before we go there, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we can explore that whole concept of the moral compass and how it relates to our social interactions.
All right, so we've been talking about this high road and low road of social processing, and it seems like having a, well-functioning prefrontal cortex is pretty key for navigating all the ups and downs of social life. But you also brought up this whole moral compass thing. What does that actually mean when we're talking about social intelligence?
It's a really interesting idea. Goldman basically says that some social emotions like shame, guilt, pride, and even he calls it altruistic anger, act as a kind of inner compass to, guide our behavior.
Okay.
So these emotions, they help us tell the difference between right and wrong, right? They encourage us to take responsibility for the things we do, and they push us to, try to make things right when we mess up.
I see how that ties into social intelligence then. It's not just about understanding other people's emotions, but also about having that internal sense of accountability.
Exactly.
And didn't Goldman use that story about the basketball coach, John Chaney, to illustrate this point?
Yes. Cheney, remember, he told one of his players to commit a really dangerous foul, but then he was like instantly overcome with remorse.
Right.
He apologized like crazy, took full responsibility, and even offered to pay the injured player's medical bills.
Wow.
I mean, talk about a clear example of someone with a strong moral compass.
It does make you wonder, though, what about the people who, don't seem to have that same sense of guilt or remorse when they hurt others? Like, where does that disconnect, that lack of empathy, even come from?
Goleman explores that too. He talks about what he calls the dark triad of personality traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And these are the folks who often lack empathy and are much more likely to manipulate or exploit others to, to get what they want.
Okay, that's getting a little creepy now. So how do we, like, spot these dark triad types in real life? I mean, we've all met people who are maybe a little self-centered or, can be manipulative sometimes. But how do we know if it's something more serious?
Right. Well, it is important to remember that those terms, those are like clinical terms, and they have very specific diagnostic criteria. But Golan does give some examples to help us understand how these traits might actually play out. So, for instance, someone high in Machiavellianism, they might be very charming and persuasive,
Right.
but ultimately they're using those skills to deceive and manipulate others just for their own personal gain.
I see.
And then a narcissist, right? They're going to constantly be looking for admiration, for validation, and they're going to lack any real concern for other people's feelings.
So in other words, social intelligence isn't just about being likable or outgoing. It's also about being able to, recognize those red flags and protect ourselves from people who might take advantage of our trust.
Exactly.
But now I'm wondering, how much of our social intelligence is actually, like, innate, something we're born with? And how much is learned? Like, can we develop it over time, or are we just kind of stuck with what we've got?
That is the question, isn't it? And like with most things, when it comes to human behavior, it's a complex mix of nature and nurture. Goleman dives into some of Jerome Kagan's research on what are called inhibited children. So these are kids who are more sensitive and fearful in new situations. And that suggests that there might be a genetic predisposition, right, to shyness or even social anxiety.
Wow.
But he also makes it very clear that early experiences, particularly those with parents and caregivers, play a huge role in shaping our social development.
Okay, so even if we're born with certain tendencies, you're saying it's not like set in stone, right? Like our environment can still shape how those tendencies actually play out in our lives.
Exactly. And Goleman even brings up that incredible research on rat pups that showed how maternal care could literally change gene activity.
Wow.
I know. So the mother rat's nurturing behavior actually changes how certain genes are expressed in the pups, which then influences their stress response and their social behavior.
That is mind-blowing. So you're saying our social experiences are actually shaping our biology from a very young age.
It really is. And it just highlights how important it is to create these nurturing, supportive environments for kids, right? From the very beginning.
Absolutely. But what about us grown-ups? Can we still, like, improve our social intelligence later in life?
Absolutely. While those early experiences are definitely the foundation, our brains are amazingly adaptable. They can change and grow throughout our lives.
That's good to hear.
Right. So Goleman really emphasizes that social intelligence, it's like any other skill. It can be learned, it can be improved with conscious effort and practice.
Okay, that's encouraging. But with all the information and distractions we're constantly bombarded with these days, how do we even find the time and space to, cultivate those skills? Especially in a world that often feels so, I don't know, disconnected.
That's a great point. And that brings us to Goleman's whole discussion of social corrosion, which we touched on earlier.
Right.
It's basically that gradual erosion of social connection and norms that can have a really devastating impact on both individuals and communities.
When you first mentioned social corrosion, it sounded almost like, I don't know, like a disease or something.
Right.
And honestly, reading about the kindergarten class in Texas with that, like, totally out of control 6-year-old is pretty disturbing.
It is concerning.
Yeah, it's like you're witnessing the breakdown of basic social skills, like what's going on.
And while there are a lot of factors contributing to this trend, for sure, I mean, from too much screen time to societal pressures, Goleman's argument is that this lack of social intelligence is a major player. When kids don't have the chance to develop empathy, emotional regulation, conflict resolution skills, it can lead to more aggression, anxiety, and, yeah, social isolation.
It does paint a kind of bleak picture, to be honest. But if this social corrosion is happening on such a wide scale, can we, like as individuals, even make a difference?
Golan believes we can. And while we can't solve all these big societal problems on our own, we can at least start by focusing on our own little corner of the world, right? We can model empathy and respect in our own interactions, create supportive environments for the kids in our lives, and, even advocate for policies that support social emotional learning and community engagement.
So it's about creating these like little pockets of connection that can then hopefully ripple outward.
Exactly. And this actually brings us to one of the most powerful and maybe even surprising aspects of social intelligence, its impact on our health and well-being. Goleman spends a lot of time in his book exploring that deep connection between our social lives and our physical and mental health.
We always hear about how important social connections are, but I'm curious to hear more about like the science behind it. What is the link between social intelligence and well-being?
Okay, so Goleman presents a bunch of research that shows how strong social ties actually act as a buffer against stress. They can even help us live longer.
Really?
Yeah, think about it. When you feel supported, when you feel connected, you're just better equipped to deal with all the curveballs life thrown at you.
That makes sense. But what about the relationships that, cause more stress than joy? I'm thinking toxic friendships, difficult family members, or even like those work relationships that just leave you feeling drained and frustrated. How do those affect our well-being?
Oh, Goleman doesn't shy away from those tough situations either. He really contrasts those benefits of positive relationships with the harmful effects of negative ones, especially when we're talking about chronic stress.
So constant arguments, power struggles, or just feeling emotionally unsafe, that can really take a toll on our physical and mental health.
Absolutely. And he even gets into the actual biological mechanisms involved. He talks about the role of cortisol, the HPA axis in the stress response. And when that HPA axis is constantly activated because we're always stressed out, it can lead to a whole bunch of negative health consequences, from increased inflammation to a weakened immune system.
Wow. It's a reminder that our social interactions aren't just about, fleeting emotions. They have a real impact on our bodies and our long-term health.
Right.
But with all this talk of social corrosion and toxic relationships, it's easy to feel a little, I don't know, discouraged. Are there any specific things we can do, any strategies or antidotes we can focus on to, build healthier connections and actually boost our own social intelligence?
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at some of the practical tools and techniques that Goleman gives us for strengthening our social skills and building more meaningful relationships.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot, like a lot. Neural tango, dark triad. I feel like I'm getting like an honorary PhD in social intelligence just listening to you. But I do want to get to the more practical stuff. What can we actually do to become more socially intelligent, especially in a world that honestly could feel pretty isolating?
Right, that's the big question, isn't it? And luckily, Goleman doesn't leave us hanging with all these theories. He actually offers some pretty concrete strategies to help us strengthen our social intelligence. And one of the most important, maybe the most basic one, is developing what he calls emotional literacy.
Emotional literacy, that sounds like something we should have learned back in like kindergarten or something. But seriously, what does that even mean and how does it relate to social intelligence?
Well, it basically means becoming more aware of our own emotions. Like, think about it this way. You wouldn't try to navigate a new city without a map, right? Emotional literacy, that's our map for our own inner world. It helps us understand, what triggers us, how we typically react to things, and even the needs that are driving those emotions.
So it's not just about like labeling our emotions happy, sad, angry. It's about going deeper and understanding the why.
Exactly.
It kind of reminds me of what we were saying before about the high road and low roads of social processing.
Yeah.
By developing this emotional literacy, we're basically strengthening that ability to use that more conscious and deliberate pathway, right?
You got it. The more we understand our own emotional patterns, the less likely they are to, hijack us in social situations. We can actually hit pause, think things through, and then choose a response that's in line with our values and goals, not just react impulsively.
So instead of just like losing it when someone cuts us off in traffic,
Exactly.
we can take a breath and, choose a more constructive way to respond. But okay, how do we actually cultivate this emotional literacy thing? Are we talking therapy, meditation retreats, some kind of intense emotional boot camp?
Well, Goleman has a bunch of different practices, some simple, some more involved, but he's a big believer in mindfulness. Paying attention to our thoughts and feelings and what's going on in our bodies without judging ourselves. Even just taking a few minutes every day to like really tune in to what we're experiencing can make a big difference.
So no need to like become a Zen master overnight.
Exactly.
You're making me think about how often I'm just on autopilot, you know, just rushing through the day without really stopping to think about how I'm feeling or why.
That happens to all of us. It's kind of the norm in our super fast-paced world, right? But Goleman's point is that this lack of self-awareness, it can create all sorts of problems in our relationships. We might misinterpret what other people mean, overreact to situations, or get stuck in those negative patterns of interacting.
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to see that. So emotional literacy is definitely going on my to-do list. But what about empathy? We talked about it a bit, but I'd love to dig a little deeper. How does that fit into the whole social intelligence puzzle?
Empathy really is at the heart of it all. It's that ability to understand and share the feelings of other people, to walk in their shoes and see the world from their point of view.
Hmm.
And it's not just about being nice or feeling sorry for someone. It's about that deeper connection.
So instead of just saying something generic like, oh, everything happens for a reason,
Right.
we really take the time to listen, to acknowledge their feelings, and try to actually understand what they're going through.
Exactly.
But I'm also thinking, isn't there a risk of like getting overwhelmed about other people's emotions? Especially if you're someone who's already pretty empathetic.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Goleman makes it clear that empathy doesn't mean absorbing other people's pain as your own, right? It's about finding that sweet spot between compassion and having healthy boundaries.
Right. So it's about holding space for someone's experience without like drowning in it ourselves.
Exactly. It's like that oxygen mask analogy. We have to take care of ourselves first before we can really help anyone else.
That's a good one.
And this ability to empathize, it's not only crucial for our personal relationships, but Goleman also talks about how important it is for leaders. He argues that the leaders who can really understand and respond to their team's needs, on an emotional level, they're more likely to create an environment of trust and collaboration, and that leads to better performance overall.
That makes sense. I mean, no one wants to work for a boss who's totally clueless about how they're feeling. And in a world where we're collaborating more and more, empathy just becomes even more essential.
Absolutely. Goleman even takes it a step further. He introduces this concept of healing relationships. These are the connections that can actually protect us from stress, help us thrive, and even, believe it or not, help us heal physically.
That takes us back to that biological allies idea, right? The people who make us feel safe and supported, which actually helps calm our nervous systems down.
Exactly. And Goleman's point is that these healing relationships, they can be found in all parts of our lives. Family, friends, partners, therapists, even coworkers.
It's a good reminder that we're not meant to go through life alone, you know, and that investing in these meaningful connections is not just some fluffy feel-good thing. It's actually vital for our well-being.
Well said. And I think, as we wrap up this deep dive into Daniel Goleman's social intelligence, the big takeaway is that social intelligence isn't something fixed or predetermined. It's a set of skills that we can work on and improve throughout our lives.
It's pretty empowering to know that we have the power to become more socially intelligent, no matter where we're starting from.
It really is. And by doing that, we're not only making our own lives better, but we're also contributing to a world that's a little kinder, more connected, and hopefully a little more in tune with each other.
This has been such an insightful conversation. I feel like I learned so much. Thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive.
My pleasure. Always great to chat with you about this stuff.
And to all of you listening, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We hope you found this exploration of social intelligence as interesting and thought-provoking as we did. And remember, the journey toward greater social awareness and connection, it never really ends, right? It's a process, and every step we take in that direction, it matters. So keep learning, keep practicing, and keep connecting. We'll see you next time.